Hello and welcome to the first Caltech Y Friends webinar. We are so excited to have you join us. I'm Laura, the Student Executive Committee President, and I'm a senior studying computer science and English. And the Y has been an integral part of my life at Caltech. Programs across the Y's pillars of leadership, service, adventure, civic engagement, and perspective have enriched student experiences and shaped better citizens of the world. Coming up next, we're going to share a short video about the RISE program. RISE is a math and science tutoring program connecting Caltech students to Pasadena 8th through 12th graders struggling in STEM subjects. The virtual setting poses challenges and new opportunities as we adapt our programming, and our RISE tutoring program actually grew significantly after going fully remote. Let's hear more.
Hello, I'm Brian McDonald, Superintendent of the Pasadena Unified School District. For more than a decade, the Caltech Y has supported our students with intensive math and science tutoring and academic mentoring. Caltech Y tutors prepare our students for college-level math and science and helping them reach their goals. The exposure to real scientists in our backyard has been life-changing for students who otherwise might not have considered higher education or careers in science, technology, engineering, and mathematics. During the pandemic and our school's shift to remote learning, Caltech Y rose to the occasion, expanding free services to offer more students opportunities to grow their math and science skills. Its expanded drop-in program reaches more students at this critical time in our history. I would like to thank Caltech Y for all that it does for the students of the Pasadena Unified School District.
My name is Maria G. Vargas. I have 3 kids for which every day we fight for them to have a university degree. I only finished high school, therefore I don't have much knowledge or everything that my children have learned in the Caltech Y program. Thanks to you, my children have had several awards with high honors. This has helped them to have high self-esteem because they know they earned their university degree. Thank you very much for your great support.
Our son was very fortunate to have been in the RISE program. He had some mild ADHD, and the tutoring sessions were the only times during the week when he could focus on his schoolwork without any distractions. And that was an important experience for him. He also had enormous respect and admiration for the Caltech students who, not only were they brilliant, they were down to earth and easy to connect with. He could see that they had a strong work ethic, that they were patient, and that they had faith in him to learn.
I'm Melba Newson. I'm an undergraduate junior studying computer science. I'm really glad that I made this decision to tutor in the RISE program because tutoring with the RISE program and working with my students has definitely been a highlight in my time at Caltech so far. The students that I work with are always really excited to learn and try their best. As I'm teaching them, they're also teaching me. We work together to find the best ways to communicate with one another. So while I'm sharing what I learned, I'm also practicing my own communication skills and teaching skills, as my students and I are learning and growing together. Lastly, the RISE tutoring program gives me perspective. Caltech is a very special place, as I'm sure you already know. The RISE program gives me some time to step away from all of that. Even if it's just for a few hours a week, it's nice to step outside of that bubble. Thank you all for your support. Your contribution will positively impact our students and will be the foundation to reshape our educational resources.
Hey everyone, and welcome to the first ever Caltech Y Friends webinar. My name is Nathan Delaska. I work and teach at Caltech, and I'm also a board member on the Caltech Y. We're very pleased that you've joined us for what we hope is only a temporary replacement of our tradition of in-person Caltech Y Friends dinners at the Athenaeum. Tonight, our panelists are going to discuss their experiences with the abrupt transition to remote learning earlier this year and give us their thoughts on what lessons they learned and what opportunities they see for the future. We're going to begin with short presentations from each of our panelists. Then our panelists will answer some of the questions received from you when you registered for our program. If you have a question you'd like our panelists to answer, please type it into the Q&A box down at the bottom of your screen in your Zoom window, and we'll have our panelists answer as many of them as we can in the final portion of the hour. Our first short presentation is going to be from Leslie Maxfield and Jenn Weaver. Leslie is the Director of Academic Media Technologies and Communications at Caltech. In this role, she leads what she describes as a fantastic team, creating award-winning films about Caltech's community, research and discoveries, and supports Caltech teachers with the tools and training for remote instruction. Leslie is a Caltech alumna and is also a graduate of the University of California, Berkeley. Jenn is the Associate Director for University Teaching at Caltech's Center for Teaching, Learning, and Outreach, the CTLO. She taught the first course at Caltech for Caltech faculty on teaching in university STEM and created the first course for Caltech undergraduates and postdocs on course design. She just finished teaching her 5th faculty summer short course on course design, and I'm sure it will not surprise you that this class was also taught remotely. Jenn earned a PhD from the University of Toronto with a focus on ecological modeling. While she was at U of T, she also gained significant experience as a lecturer for large undergraduate STEM classes. Okay, so again, if you have questions you'd like to ask Leslie and Jenn, and then later on, Katie and Arushi, open the Q&A box and type in your question, and we'll be collecting those and try to include them in the final segment of the webinar. Okay, Leslie and Jenn, go ahead.
Thanks so much, Nathan. So Jenn and I will be talking about how we came together as a Caltech community to the remote teaching and learning that we pivoted to in the spring. So Caltech is known for its freedom that it affords to its faculty and PIs for its research pursuits. And that also applies for their teaching endeavors. There is more than one way to teach a Caltech course. So before we had to pivot, faculty and instructors and TAs had many different approaches in how to teach a course. They could use technology or not use technology. Course materials were quite decentralized. Some courses had websites, others used an old open source learning management system called Moodle. Some courses didn't use websites at all. Most classes were taught in person. There were a few flipped classes. A flipped class is when students watch a pre-recorded lecture and then they show up to class time and they use that time for active problem solving and discussion. Some courses were recorded, but mostly as a study tool. This is called lecture capture, and it is a common practice at other universities. Lectures were delivered in a variety of ways: PowerPoint, Keynote, LaTeX, PDF slides. Some instructors used chalkboards or whiteboards, and many were more discussion style, sitting around a table or with a group, and then providing handwritten and typed notes afterwards. Assignments, of course, were turned in on campus, either in a mail slot or a box, or some were emailed. And then on March 13th, it was announced that the spring term would be online and would be remote. So this afforded 3 key opportunities ahead of us. The first, we could incorporate more technology in the pedagogy and also change how technology is used in our teaching and learning. We could engage with students in new and different ways, and faculty and instructors could revisit their course design and structure. And many, this was the first time they had done that in 10, 20, 30 years. So I'm going to tackle just the technology piece. So many instructors, when they went into their classroom to give a talk and to give their course, they didn't use technology. So when we were trying to think about putting platforms in place, we had to make sure that we were providing technology and tools that those instructors could use, as well as the instructors that were using the latest and greatest third-party tools. Some instructors were already using technology in their classroom. We needed to make sure that all those pieces work together in a fluid way. And the way that we did this is that we expanded the existing tools that we had in our teaching and learning landscape. We integrated the third-party tools into the Caltech suite, And by that, I mean we made sure that they were only accessible by Caltech credentials, and so that protected student privacy. And then we had to adopt some new technologies that weren't available with the tools that we already had. And so that's all summed up in this one slide, this flow chart. At the very top in the orange box is a learning management system. In the spring term, we expanded Moodle. That was our old open source LMS. And I have Canvas here because that's what we're using now for the fall term. It's a more modern LMS. A learning management system is like a course hub. It's where faculty and students can go to get and to put their course materials. It's a one-stop shop for teaching and learning. Rolled up into that are all the different course components. And then the green and the purple rows here show all the different supported tools that help create the different course components. So when you think of an in-person course, you can break it down into these different blue boxes. Faculty and instructors and TAs need a way to communicate with students and have announcements. They need to have a way to convene students together in a live session, either for their lecture or for office hours. There needs to be a way for somebody to pre-record their lecture, the tools, the hardware, and then also to deliver those recordings. Students need to be able to get problem sets and return problem sets in exams, and instructors and TAs need to be able to grade and give feedback to students. And then this last piece in blue is the heart of a Caltech course, student collaboration. We know that students would spend hours working on problem sets in their on-campus houses. How do we give them that opportunity when they're in their individual homes? So the supported tools are here in green. Supported means that, again, it's behind the Caltech credential, and Caltech staff can offer help if there's any training or support request that's needed. So in many cases, the supported tool is the learning management system. For the live class sessions, we expanded the Zoom licenses across campus, like what we're using now. We implemented a new tool, Google's G Suite for Education, and with that, Google's tools for education, came Google Hangouts and Google Meet. So that was another video conferencing tool. This gave faculty and students the choice to use Zoom to meet with one another live, or to use Google Hangouts Meet. And so if one failed, then they could seamlessly move over to the other platform. The G Suite tool also offered Google Drive. We asked for equity purposes for any live session that was held that it be recorded. So we needed a platform to deliver hour-long recordings to students. And the Google Drive platform uses the same streaming media technology as YouTube. Some students couldn't attend live class sessions because they were at a different time zone or they didn't have good network. So this was a way for students to still get that material. The purple items were some third-party tools that our physics and CS and math faculty were already using. And so we wanted to make sure that these supported tools would roll up and work within the hub. So with this roadmap, it gave us the tools for those instructors who weren't comfortable using technology to start building those pieces. But because other tools could also be used, it afforded the flexibility and the freedom that our instructors are used to doing in the classroom. So some examples of experimenting with technology for those instructors who love their chalkboards and whiteboards. Many of them moved to tablets like this graphic drawing tablet, a Wacom Cintiq that Mike Brown is using here. And many also used iPads and Apple Pencils. One professor used a light board. So this is like a transparent whiteboard. It allowed him to still write on the light board and still look at the camera without having to look down and then look back up, and that increased engagement. We were able to connect this professor with the Caltech Carpenter Shop, and so the carpenters could build light boards for instructors to have in their homes or their Caltech office. And for those instructors who couldn't adopt any digital technology, we provided document cameras. So these are cameras that then focus on a single plane, and instructors could just write on a piece of paper, and that would be a video feed into the Zoom session. Besides these fun tools, the new LMS that we're using now, Canvas, allows us to look at student performance and track them in ways to help foster student success. We can look at analytics and metrics to see if students are struggling, and then offer them tutors or any other support that they need to be successful. So I will now move this over to Jenn to take over the next piece.
Thanks, Leslie. So it was interesting when Leslie and I were coming up with this presentation and designing what we would talk about. We were talking about some three key opportunities and 3 key challenges in pivoting to remote learning. And what we decided or quickly figured out were that these were more or less the same thing. So we combined them together. So our second key opportunity, which was also a challenge, was how to engage students in new and different ways. Next slide, please, Leslie. So in that transition, we asked faculty what they found to work best for them in that spring quarter so that we could share it with our fall quarter faculty and how they were engaging students and building community. And they shared 5, so there's 5 main themes of what we kept hearing. One was that they could meet one-on-one with students at the beginning of quarter and they could create those more personal relationships. They could have the student or invite them to turn on their video camera so they could see their faces, have that personal connection. And that invited them to be more engaged or invited students to be more engaged over the quarter as well, because there's that sort of personal connection, comfortability, sense of belonging in the class. They also said that encouraging collaboration through different mechanisms, so such as using Zoom breakout rooms to allow students to actively problem solve together. And we often found that when students were able to work together in small groups and talk to each other and peer teach, that they were also much more likely to engage in the class when they were brought back to the, quote, bigger classroom or all together in one class. Faculty also said that communicating often and much more often, or perhaps in a different medium, was necessary for online. So communicating clearly and more frequently with students. And they also found that there was a need to solicit that feedback. So getting feedback early in class via polling, surveys, chat box messages, but any way to get a pulse on where the class is and what might be going right and what might be not going so right that they can quickly adjust and pivot to. And then finally, checking in with students. So coming early to class, having that casual discussion before class, sharing the experience of the sort of crazy, tumultuous world that we're living in right now, and that we're all experiencing those sort of issues with Zoom fatigue, etc. But sharing that experience, again, helped to build community with their class and within their class as well. Next slide, please. And so our third key opportunity or challenge was revisiting course design and structure. And so faculty were thinking about, okay, this is an opportunity. What can I be doing in my class? What can I do differently? Or what have I always wanted to do in my class? And Katie will be talking about this a little bit more in a few minutes. Next slide, please, Leslie. But we found that there are some best practices and successes for course design. So as faculty were thinking about how to translate their class from in-person to remote, we found that they wanted to transfer those office hours and keep those office hours and have them remotely. They wanted to keep that opportunity for students asking questions, and that could be allowed in class, or it could also not be allowed in class, allowed A-L-O-U-D, in terms of students asking in the chat box or having other medium like Slack, Piazza, discussion forums, where they could be asking those classes as well, which could engage a different type of student than those who might be putting their hands up in class. And as Leslie mentioned before, the opportunity to record lectures for viewing later. What we heard in the student surveys is that they really wanted these features to be kept when we pivot back to the in-person classroom. So this was a nice lesson learned of things that work well for remote that we also want to keep when we come back into the classroom. We saw a lot more faculty adopting a flipped classroom approach. And so with needing to record their lectures, they thought, oh, maybe I can record my lecture beforehand, make it available, and then I can use that class time to allow students to be practicing, applying, going into Zoom breakout rooms, working together, coming back to a class and reporting out. And again, that value of feedback. So more frequently soliciting student feedback. And we hope that these practices will sort of stay in their lexicon or their suite or toolkit when they come back to in-person classes. Next slide, please. So there was 3 strategies that all the offices on campus were using for support. So AMT and CTLO specifically, along with the library and the registrar and Hickson Writing Center, we're doing workshops in the summer. We had division town halls. We met with each of the division and sort of did a remote teaching 101 and shared some best practices. Lots of one-on-one consultations and office hours for the broader community, as well as an adaptable teaching series. And you can find the videos for the adaptable teaching series, as well as other resources on our teach.caltech.edu website. And there's also a learn.caltech Caltech EDU website. And both of these were created, I think as Leslie said, March 13th, as we started pivoting to that remote teaching and learning. And as I mentioned before, surveys, faculty were doing surveys of their students. We were also doing surveys of students, faculty, and TAs. And I wanted to show you in the next slide some word clouds from some of those results. You can see the sort of the top 75 words in the open-ended comments for each survey. And what I wanted to draw your attention to was that the sort of the most common used word for both faculty, instructors, and TAs were students. So thinking about students, how can we best be serving, teaching, supporting students in their learning? Next slide, please. And I wanted to share some of the comments that students were giving in those surveys. The themes here were appreciating faculty's efforts in the classroom, as well as TAs appreciating their TA teams and the instructional teams that they were working with, and faculty noting that while it's not the same, we still have this opportunity to be using this medium as best as we can to be engaging and teaching our students. Next slide, please, Leslie.
Okay, so where we are now. So we as a community, Caltech is stronger and more united behind teaching and learning. We have this centralized place where faculty and students can go to for their course materials. As Jenn already mentioned, campus units across all of Caltech, we are continuously discussing student and faculty well-being and also how we can provide a better integrated support in these efforts to preserve the rigorous Caltech academic experience. We are continuing to care, communicate, collaborate, evolve, experiment, explore, improve, innovate, learn, plan for the future, reflect, and solicit feedback and ideas. We admit there are still many challenges and unknowns. It is a steep learning curve to adopt a new pedagogy or technology. There are many collaboration strategies and platforms. We're right now about to launch a new virtual world platform for students to get together socially and possibly for virtual events. And then that question, how much longer will we be doing this? So those are all some unknowns. Jenn mentioned the feedback that students actually found pieces that they want to bring back when we're all back together. And I think the silver lining here is when we come back together, we're going to have some new tools and new ways of teaching and learning that's going to enrich the Caltech experience. So Nathan, that's it for Jenn and I for our talk. Here are those websites again, and if you want to reach out to CTLO or AMT, please email us at these email addresses.
Thank you very much, Leslie and Jenn, for the comprehensive review of what tools were at teachers' and students' disposal. Our next two panelists are Caltech professor Katie Bouman and Caltech undergraduate student Arushi Gupta. Professor Bouman is an assistant professor of computing and mathematical sciences. Before joining the faculty of Caltech, she was a postdoctoral fellow in the Harvard-Smithsonian Center for Astrophysics. She received her PhD in the Computer Science and Artificial Intelligence Laboratory, known as CSAIL, at MIT in Electrical Engineering and Computer Science, and her bachelor's degree in Electrical Engineering from the University of Michigan. The focus of her research is on using emerging computational methods to push the boundaries of interdisciplinary imaging. Katie was a key member of the International Event Horizon Telescope collaboration that was the first group to publish an image of a black hole. She was a pretty big deal, quite a bit famous for that back in, I think, 2019. And it also won a breakthrough prize for the entire team of that Event Horizon Telescope collaboration. Arushi Gupta is a senior at Caltech who's majoring in mathematics and minoring in computer science. She has been an active participant in Caltech student government, serving for the last year and a half as chair of the Academics and Research Committee. We're going to give Katie and Arushi each up to 5 minutes, uninterrupted, to tell us about their experiment with remote learning. Katie, you get to go ahead first.
Sure. Hi, everyone. Let's see. So thanks so much for inviting me here, and I'm looking forward to answering questions in a little bit. But before doing that, I just wanted to tell you a little bit about the class that I taught last spring, and how I had to adjust the class for the online learning, what was difficult, and also kind of the opportunities that it also provided. And just so a little bit of background, so this class was computational cameras. That was the name of the class. It was actually the first time teaching the class, actually the first time I actually ever taught at Caltech. So Jenn's class on for faculty and how to put together a new course was like very valuable to me, especially given everything else that kind of got piled on at the last minute. So it was a learning experience for me in many different ways. So you might ask what computational cameras are. I think the easiest way to explain it in terms of medical imaging, because people are familiar somewhat with that. So when you want to take a picture, for instance, of your brain, you can't go and just take a regular camera and point it at your head and get a picture back. And so because we can't do that, we have to come up with new unique sensors that are able to take indirect measurements that tell us something about the image that we'd like to recover. But because these measurements don't look anything like the picture themselves, we have to use algorithms in conjunction with this new kind of sensing system in order to recover a picture. So computational cameras are really about how do we put computation into the imaging pipeline and come up with new sensing techniques and algorithms that work together to see things that you wouldn't be able to see otherwise. But actually, you don't have to go to, computational cameras are all around you. So for instance, when you take a picture with your phone, the sensor, the imaging sensor on your phone actually doesn't have the ability to, for instance, see very high dynamic range like our eyes do. And so even in something like that, there's tons of computation going on behind the scenes to make a picture that looks good. So for instance, one common thing that is in most phone cameras these days is that HDR setting, high dynamic range setting, and where it takes multiple exposures and merges that information together to make a image that is more pleasing, more like what our eye sees. So these are just different kinds of computational cameras and how they're around us, helping in many different scientific and technological areas. So computational cameras really requires that it's a merging of different fields. So it merges ideas in computer vision, image processing, computer graphics, how light is propagating around us, and also hardware and sensors, because you really have to understand the interaction of these things. So a big part of computational cameras is, as I said, understanding sensors, and although software is very important, without understanding the hardware, you really are missing a huge chunk of it. So it was very important to me that the students got a full understanding of all of these different kind of pieces that come together to form a computational camera. And so usually in classes like this, the ones that I know of, people usually have cameras that the students check out, and they're able to change different settings. And so they get a feel for how a camera works and how can you modify how you take an image and with an algorithm to do something special with it. So unfortunately, when we went all online, I couldn't buy every student in the class a $3,000 camera that you'd usually be working with. So instead, I decided to move over to something that the students could still get a hands-on kind of experience and understand sensors and understand how imaging sensors work, but do it in something that they could actually have at home. So due to generous support from the Caltech CTLO Innovation and Education Fund, I was able to purchase a Raspberry Pi and a camera for each student in the class. And so I got to send every student one of these kind of small cameras that they can then, they could work with on their homeworks. So as an example, they did things like building pinhole cameras where they made cool different images. They did this HDR and tone mapping, like I had talked about, is done in your phone camera, so they could take different images with their little Raspberry Pi camera, merge them together. They did things like by taking multiple images and finding and understanding how objects in the world can move, are projected onto the image plane. They could build these light field cameras so you could identify not just the projection of light, but actually know the full how light is propagating throughout an entire scene, and they could reconstruct this full light field. We also did some cool things where, for instance, they set up their Raspberry Pi to look at a little corner. And from this, by understanding how light propagates around the corner, they were able to plug in the equations to allow it to recover a picture of where people were moving behind the wall. So here was one student, she set it up so the camera is pointed at the corner, and you get this image that you can't, it looks something like this, where you can't really see anything, you can't see the person moving, but by processing it, she's able to see this trajectory as she's moving around. The x-axis here is angular position, and the y-axis here is time. So you can see as the person is moving back and forth, it causes this line to appear on the ground. So they were able to do this with the Raspberry Pi camera, which I thought was pretty cool. And then in the last assignment, before their final project, we actually broke these cameras. So because they're fairly cheap, we could break them by taking the lens off. They replaced the lens with a piece of Scotch tape. And by understanding how light is propagating and hitting that sensor, they could then solve an inverse problem to, although the image that they collect looks something like this on the left-hand side, by understanding how light is moving through that Scotch tape and hitting the sensor, they could invert the problem to recover the picture here on the right that the camera was actually pointing at. So it was lots of cool different ways that we were able to incorporate this Raspberry Pi camera into different kinds of assignments that I wouldn't have done otherwise. So I think that was pretty neat. Another thing of how I had to adjust for this new class, because we didn't have a whiteboard to explain ideas, I did a lot of animations with my PowerPoint slides, but also it provided a way to get to get feedback in the class in what people were understanding and not understanding. So I regularly put little kinds of questions. Although I'd ask questions and ask for people to respond out loud, for people who were shy, they might not want to do that. So instead, I could use the little the buttons on Zoom for people to answer questions throughout the class, so I could track what they understood or what they didn't, and also just help engage them in the class. Another thing that that the online teaching allowed us to do is bring in some invited speakers. So for instance, I was able to get speakers from across the country. Here were the two speakers that joined the class to tell about some of their work at the forefront of this area of computational imaging and computer vision. And I would probably have not been able to, for instance, fly someone from Boston before, but by having an online class, we were able to get real leaders in the field from across the country to talk to the students, and I think they also enjoyed that. So that's kind of what I have to say about this. I'm happy to take your questions in a little bit.
Thank you very much, Katie. I think everybody is going to be wanting to sign up for that class now. It sounds really exciting. Okay, Arushi, you're up.
Hi, everyone. I'm going to talk a little bit about the student experience of online learning and what some of these technological shifts and some of the programs in place looked like from a student perspective. So the first thing I wanted to talk a little bit about is sort of what do online classes look like? I think Caltech did a really great job of trying to sort of maintain the quality and rigor of a Caltech class while also providing some flexibility. So for example, during spring term, the requirements for what you're allowed to take on pass-fail were relaxed a little bit. And currently there are a lot of sort of resources in place to help students who are struggling. I think a lot of the classes have different structures. So as Jenn and Leslie mentioned, we're seeing a lot more sort of flipped classes where the professors have pre-recorded videos and then still try to maintain some form of student-faculty interaction through office hours or through flipped classrooms where they do problem solving inside the class. Lab classes are also sort of affected by this, obviously. As Professor Bouman mentioned, some of the lab classes are mailing out experiments or they're using simulations to sort of give students some of that hands-on experience, even if they're not on campus. I think one of the big shifts that a lot of students have seen is that there's a lot fewer opportunities for spontaneous, casual student-faculty interaction. So sometimes it's a little harder to grab a professor after class and ask them some questions about topics that might not be directly related to the class. But I think that it's also been a good opportunity for professors to sort of reach out to students in new ways, holding more office hours and things like that, and also for students to be proactive in reaching out to their professors and asking for help and asking for meetings, as well as sort of trying to have some casual dinners and lunches and things like that with their professors. I also wanted to talk about one of the, I think, best parts of a Caltech education, collaboration. I think at Caltech, it's really a place where you almost learn more from your peers than you do from your professors. And I think Caltech has done a really great job in trying to facilitate collaboration. So for example, the iPad Loaner program gave iPads to students to borrow until online learning ends. So then students have the ability to use online whiteboards on their iPads and the ability to sort of write things in a more natural way than having to say long equations out loud or having to type them all up sort of and message them back and forth. And there has also been a lot of adoption of online whiteboards, which I think is really great both for sort of collaboration between students and also sometimes for professors who are using these technologies to give their notes to their students. So some professors will take notes on some whiteboard or collaborative space while they're giving their lecture, and then also give students access to that afterwards, which I think is really great because students then have access to all of their professors' notes and have the ability to sometimes pay more attention in class rather than struggling to write everything down if that's what works better for them. I also wanted to mention what Caltech is doing for its freshmen. As you can probably imagine, it's a very scary time to start college, not being able to come to campus and really meet people in person. But Caltech has created living learning groups. So normally when freshmen come in, they're assigned sort of a Frosh Camp group and an orientation group. But this is sort of an expanded version of that, where it's 6 to 8 students who are generally in the same time zone and with some common classes. And it's sort of a way to both get them involved in the Caltech community in a social way, but also giving them some people who are sort of built-in collaboration friends who they can talk to about their classes and get help with. I also wanted to mention some of the resources that students are taking advantage of currently. One of the big ones that we've seen students utilize more than in previous years are the Dean's Tutors. These are undergraduates who are being paid by the Dean's office and by Caltech to tutor their peers and tutor underclassmen in some of the core subjects and other classes that they might be struggling with. And I think that this has seen a huge jump in popularity, and way more people are utilizing this resource than in previous years, which I think is really great. Also, there are peer advising programs matching some of the freshmen with some upperclassmen, as well as matching upperclassmen with each other to sort of get advice on how to go through Caltech. Also, I just wanted to mention the Counseling Center is still open and operating, and I think this gives Caltech students some opportunities to help them with their mental health and other issues they might be dealing with, which, as you can probably imagine, is especially important given the pandemic. I also wanted to quickly mention what social life is like, because the dorms are all closed to undergraduates, but clubs and houses are still active. The Caltech Y is still active, and people are still running a lot of online events and trying to really engage the community and do community outreach projects. In addition, there's an undergraduate Discord, so a lot of undergrads are trying to stay connected that way, and Caltech is also sponsoring some events through the Office of Residential Experience and through some of Tom Mayen's work. That's what I wanted to say about online learning from the student perspective, and I'll pass it back for some questions.
Thank you very much, Arushi. Okay, I'm going to ask Jenn and Leslie to come back and join us too, and we'll start with some questions. My first question I want to direct to Arushi. You had something up there that sounded, I guess it was some kind of tool for connection, undergraduate Discord. It sounds more like somebody's fomenting a revolution. Can you tell us a little bit about that?
Yeah, so Discord is sort of an online messaging platform. It has text chat, voice chat, video chat, and people can sort of make different channels within sort of one Discord platform. And then you can sort of join those and read those as sort of ways to get to know people. So there's sort of one big Discord server for the Caltech undergrad community, and sort of each of the houses has their own sort of sub channel where they post some events and try to get the new freshmen involved in that way. And there are also sort of opportunities within this service so that people can use to find collaborators, like some bots where you can put in, I'm looking for people to work with me at this time, who else wants to join, which is really cool.
That sounds very convenient. So I feel like that the ability to collaborate with your peers, which is, I think, one of the hallmarks of the experience at Caltech, do you feel like you were able to achieve the same level of that? Do you feel like Frosh were able to achieve a level similar to what you had experienced in this mode of living?
I think, honestly, probably not quite. A big part of being a freshman at Caltech is sort of running into people casually, sort of in the dining hall or in your house lounges or on the Olive Walk, and sort of saying, oh, hey, are you working on the physics set? Me too. Can we talk about this problem? And a lot of those more spontaneous interactions are way, way harder to come by. So it's a little easier for upperclassmen because we all sort of have our friends, we know people in our majors, and we can sort of know who to reach out to. But for freshmen, I think it's a little bit more disorienting.
The next question I want to ask was submitted from during the registration for the webinar. And I'll just direct this to anyone who wants to answer. Was screen fatigue an issue? Everybody talks about how exhausting Zoom can be over time. What was your experience with that, and what do we do about it?
So I think for me, screen fatigue is definitely an issue, especially because it's not just teaching and but also just regular meetings throughout the day. You know, you just are always looking in the exact on everything. You just have Zoom meetings from 7 a.m. to 5 p.m. pretty much, you know, and which is not very good as well. But I think Arushi, maybe you have some feedback on on individual classes on if you had screen fatigue.
I think there is, to some extent. I think a lot of sort of the asynchronous parts are a little bit less fatiguing than sort of sitting there at an assigned time. You have to listen to people talk at you and not really interact back sometimes. But at the same time, I think a lot of college-age students at this point are quite used to using computers for extended periods of time. So there's some sort of getting used to it, and I think that it's sort of fading a little bit more now that we're sort of all getting used to online learning and have been doing this for quite a few months.
Okay, maybe Jenn or Leslie could talk about this one. It's another registration question. As remote learning becomes normalized, how will Caltech, oh, I'm sorry. I want to ask a different one. Is remote learning here to stay beyond COVID? Are we all going to keep using these resources, or do you think that people will just go back to a classroom format for most interactions? Jenn, any thoughts?
Sure. Well, I think some of the technology used and some of the ways of engaging our students are definitely here to stay. And we've been hearing that from students, and we've been hearing that from faculty. As to whether many of the courses would actually stay online as online only courses, I guess remains to be seen. what we have been hearing, I think, from everyone is that everyone's excited to be back in the classroom, teaching at the front of the class, and students in the class. That engagement, that level of excitement, I think the emotional sort of connection that you can have with your students. Technology is never quite going to be the same in terms of getting that satisfaction and enjoyment, I think, from that teaching experience. So to a certain extent, I think that classroom component, but I think maybe taking some of the lessons learned from technology, from remote learning, we're definitely going to see as well. Leslie, did you have anything to?
Yeah, I mean, this whole experience, I've heard from faculty that their whole idea of teaching has been energized and reinvigorated. And so that will definitely come into the in-person classroom. And because there is so much freedom and flexibility, they'll get to pick and choose and see which of these tools that they've now experimented with and these new innovative ideas like what Katie came up with and what Arushi experienced, they'll be able to choose what works best to improve their teaching and classroom experience.
Katie, are you going to stay remote or go into a classroom?
No, I think I really miss the interaction, the in-person interaction, but I do think that there is a lot of things that it is good to force ourselves a little bit out of our comfort zone to do things that I think people, at least I know from talking to other faculty, that I think will be good and that will carry over. One thing I think is, for instance, recording lectures. I know as a student myself, when I was an undergrad, I never could listen to a lecture and take notes at the same time. I had to choose one or the other, and just because, you know, so, and I think that that's the case with a lot of students. Some students need more time to digest material, and so having a recorded lecture allows you to, after class, go through and re-listen to a part that you maybe missed or something along these lines, and I think that that will help a lot as an aid in addition to the in-person teaching in the future. So I'm really excited that there'll be a lot more classes that will make it online in addition to in person.
And so we do have plans. Some divisions are interested in putting that automated recording capabilities in classrooms so we could do exactly what Katie just said in an automated way, that lecture capture.
Yeah, also from a student perspective, I think some of the technologies that were adopted, especially this quarter, could be extremely useful. Like Canvas puts everything in a much more streamlined format and sort of all in the same place, as opposed to professors all sort of building their own course websites with varied levels of success, as well as sort of having online turn-in boxes instead of having to either handwrite your set and turn it into the TA directly or putting it in a drop-off box or something like that, where there's non-trivial probability that it's going to get lost somewhere along the process.
But also there is some aspects that this isn't, you know, specific to each class, but for instance, the stuff that I had done for getting the Raspberry Pis and writing new homework assignments that incorporated those throughout the class. I think that, you know, things like a lot of those worked really well and were better than I think if I had them check out other cameras instead. So things like that I would transfer to in-person teaching that I probably wouldn't have done otherwise. So. And actually, I've had professors from other universities contact me and ask for the stuff to get a Raspberry Pi working in their classes. So I think that something, I'm hoping that will be good for going forward as well.
That sounds great. Do you think one of the messages here is that we were really underutilizing our technological resources, and it took a pandemic to put us in a position where we thought about using them more effectively? Leslie?
So Nathan, I missed your question a little bit. Definitely our instructors and TAs and students were forced to use technology because there was really no other way to do it. So I think we were lucky to have the tools and that we were able to implement a solution so quickly, and that we can still hold Caltech courses during a pandemic. I have to say, about 8 years ago, we went through a similar, not a pandemic, but Caltech did experiment with the massive open online courses. So creating courses where Caltech faculty were teaching courses to 60,000 students using online technology. And some of those lessons learned 8 years ago did apply for our implementation in March. The discussion boards and chat feed, pre-recording lectures, that was a really great experience for us to ramp up quickly AMT and CTLO together.
That's a nice segue into another question. How will Caltech convince the best and brightest to actually come and attend, right? Is it going to be harder to attract them, or does it mean that nobody has to actually come here and we can still have a fully functioning Caltech with people from around the world?
So my opinion of this is that I think that we can do more to get people from around the world engaged and given the resources they need for learning, but I think nothing is going to replace the hands-on teaching at Caltech. So I think Arushi mentioned this. One of the draws, at least what I think of as one of the main draws of a place like Caltech, is not the teachers or the resources, which themselves are great, but it's actually the other students that are around you and the ones who work with you and that push you and challenge you. And so I think that there is always going to be a draw for a university like Caltech with the top student talent.
Okay. Let's see. I think we've actually covered a lot of the questions. Here's kind of a more close-in technical questions. Somebody wants to know what's the currently available best whiteboard or Jamboard interface for interacting with students. Is there a best one?
So Arushi mentioned some fantastic ones. So using OneNote or AWW app, which is a web whiteboard app, and also Miro. What's so great about these is you just go to a web page and you can be drawing on that whiteboard and your collaborators can be drawing at the same time. The reason why we launched the iPad loaner program and we chose that technology with the Apple Pencil is you can do fine drawing of all those equations and they smoothly draw like a graphing tablet. So the three that Arushi mentioned were the three that I thought were really excellent too. So OneNote, which is a Microsoft product, AWW app, and Miro, M-I-R-O.
Arushi, did you use the AWW?
Yeah, I personally have used AWW a lot for sort of collaborating with friends on problem sets and things like that. It's super easy to just go to the website. It opens up a new board and there's just an easy button to click, invite someone else or share this board. And then they get sort of a mirrored copy and can also write things.
Here's a question that may or may not pertain to Caltech. I guess it would pertain to the Frosh class. How do you give an exam to 100 students?
So I think Caltech is actually in a much better place for this than other universities. The vast majority of Caltech exams were already asynchronous. They were generally take-home exams done based on the honor code. I think there are extremely few, if any, sort of in-person exams that sort of professors or TAs proctor themselves. At least in all of the big core classes when I was going through them, you would get a PDF with the exam and I don't know, the 10 problems or whatever that they wanted you to solve. And they would have a time limit, like this will take 4 hours and you're allowed to take 1 half-hour break during it. And it's up to you to time yourself and it's up to you to sort of fulfill the honor code and not, Google the answers to the problems and only use your class notes and whatever other resources are allowed. I think that this has worked pretty well for Caltech. You can find the statistics for sort of violations of this online, and there aren't all that many. And I think it's something that Caltech students really appreciate because it allows the professors to give exam problems that are very different than sort of typical exam problems. So instead of asking questions about how much you've memorized, or sort of can you apply this formula that you know off the top of your head. They can sort of assume baseline knowledge of sort of what was covered in the lectures, and if you don't remember something, you can just go look it up, and then ask more interesting problems like, do you know how to actually think about this material? And I think that it really helps.
Here's a question that was submitted to, while you were presenting. Somebody had heard from a few folks that they were not always able to work with a faculty or a TA during office hours, as they got cut off at the end of the published time. Was this widespread or just a one-off? Is this like a Zoom scheduling issue?
Yeah, I wasn't aware of that issue. I schedule meetings and they go long and they're not cut off. So I haven't heard that as a widespread issue. Jen, you?
I was going to add that I think sometimes it was perhaps a matter of like TAs having an hour allocated and then perhaps a meeting afterwards that they had to go to. What I did hear was that oftentimes when that kind of thing was happening, or there was more questions that could be answered during office hours, that some things like discussion forums or emails or other ways of having that communication were sort of alternative means for communicating. But I also saw Arushi unmute, so I wasn't sure if you wanted to add.
Yeah, I was just going to add that I think in most classes, there's sort of one Zoom meeting where the TA joins and all of the students join. And in cases like that, generally, I personally haven't experienced any situation where the TA hasn't been able to get to everyone's questions. But there are also some classes where there's sort of an office hours queue where you sort of put your name in line, and then when they get to you, they'll get to you. And that I think generally happens for CS classes, maybe some other classes, just because in those CS classes, students often need debugging help or other things that aren't really applicable to a bigger portion of the class. And sometimes in those classes, the queue sort of runs out, or the TA runs out of time before getting to everyone. But I think that's sort of just something that happens in classes where TAs work one-on-one with people, and it's not something that's sort of limited to the online environment, and it's something that generally is combated pretty well, in my opinion, just by having more office hours. And if you don't get your question answered today, you can come back tomorrow and get it answered then.
Let's do, we're just about out of time. Let's do one more question that I think will be quick. One of our audience members asks, are graduate students able to access their lab spaces again? And are they required to social distance and wear masks? And are they tested regularly? Katie, do you have graduate students working in the lab?
Yeah, so I can answer part of this question. So I do have a lab on campus. And students are allowed to go to lab, but it's restricted. They can only go for certain times, and there can only be so many people in a lab space at a time based upon the square footage of the lab. So I think it was at 1 student per 400 square feet. It might be 1 per 300 square feet now. I forget exactly. And they have to wear masks on campus. I'm not sure about testing, but I believe testing is available for students, but I don't think that they're required to be tested on a regular basis. But that's been good. Also, recently we got some approval to also have outdoor meetings where we, for graduate students, where we work on whiteboards together with masks on in an outdoor space that has been, we make sure to disinfect before and after we go there. So this is another thing that through approval through the division office that we've been able to start doing again with our graduate students.
Great. Okay, we are at the end of our hour, so I would like to thank all of our panelists again. Thank you very much, Arushi, Katie, Jen, and Leslie. And now I want to introduce Fred Clayton. Fred is the Caltech Y board, and he has a few words to say in closing. So thank you again, everyone, and have a great evening.
Thank you very much, Nathan. You did a superb job, I must tell you. You must have a lot of prior experience as a moderator, but thank you very much. And Katie, Jen, Leslie, and Arushi, you were absolutely fabulous. I think what we learned today, many of us can use in our other endeavors beyond the education field, and certainly the Caltech Y, I'm sure will be adopting and probably already has adopted many of the methodologies that are now being used at the Institute. So thank you. This is a fascinating program. And the Q&A was equally robust. So it was terrific. I wish to thank Nancy Land, my fellow board member and the person who chairs our Friends Committee and her committee for organizing this great event. Actually, she and they have been talking prior to COVID about a different format for this program, for a Friends program. And so I think it's great that they were way ahead of time in terms of how they've conceived something different that we think all of you, we hope all of you enjoy. And Agnes Tong and the Caltech Y staff, it's evident that this program was produced expertly and seamlessly. So that is a good indication of how much work went into it. So we all thank you very much for that. And finally, all of you who joined us for this webinar today, all of our Caltech Y friends, we are so grateful that you were with us today, and also for your support over the many years. You mean the world to us, and without your support, we wouldn't be able to do nearly the programs that we offer each year. And I'm sure that Laura Hu, our student ex-com president, would echo that. So we thank you very much for your support, and we hope that you'll invite your friends to become friends of the Y, and that if you direct them to caltechy.org, they would be able to register their interest there and become a friend. So thank you very much, and I hope you have a wonderful weekend. This concludes our program. Good evening.